The first sign that something was wrong did not arrive as a scream or a confession, but as repetition. In the quiet arithmetic of plantation records, ledgers meant to reduce human lives to dates, weights, and values, a single enslaved woman's name began to appear again and again. Different plantations, different parishes, different years, and always the same notation beside her name: childbirth. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. Enslaved women giving birth was expected, even encouraged, their fertility folded into the logic of profit. But clerks who copied these books from one office to another, men trained to notice inventory rather than injustice, began to sense a pattern they were never meant to acknowledge. The spacing between the births was too precise, the transfers too timely. The same woman did not simply pass through 5 plantations by chance. Her name resurfaced like a ghost that refused to stay buried, leaving faint fingerprints across the paperwork of slavery. In a system obsessed with categorization, names mattered. Enslaved people were often renamed, misspelled, or reduced to first names only, a tactic that blurred continuity and erased lineage. That is what made her presence so striking. Her name, unchanged, clearly written, persisted. It survived overseers, estate sales, and shifting ownership. It appeared in plantation books kept miles apart, sometimes decades apart, as if the system itself could not quite smother her existence. Each time the record was clinical: date of birth, sex of the child, value assessed. No emotion, no context, no acknowledgement of the woman behind the ink. Yet taken together, the entries formed a trail that told a story no one intended to tell. The clerks who noticed could not ask questions. Their role was to copy, not interpret. Plantation records were sacred objects, treated as truth even when they lied by omission. Still, patterns unsettled them. 5 births, 5 different plantations, each move aligning closely with pregnancy or recovery. The margins whispered what the official language refused to say. She was being moved not as labor alone, but as a reproductive asset. Her body had become transferable capital, circulated among estates in a way that maximized return while minimizing accountability. To recognize this openly would have required admitting that slavery was not only about fields and factories, but about controlled reproduction, a truth too dangerous for the system to name. These records were never meant to survive scrutiny. They were tools of control, designed for efficiency, not memory. Yet time has a way of exposing what power tries to conceal. When historians later placed these ledgers side by side, the repetition became impossible to ignore. It was not just her name that traveled, it was the evidence of what was done to her. Each birth was proof that her body had been claimed repeatedly, her consent irrelevant, her suffering normalized. The fact that her name endured suggests that someone, somewhere, failed to erase her completely. And in that failure, the truth slipped through. What makes this story especially haunting is how ordinary it looked at the time. There were no scandalous notes, no warnings scribbled in red ink. The same language used to describe livestock appeared beside her name. Transferred, delivered, recovered. The vocabulary of commerce replaced the language of humanity. And yet, hidden inside that cold precision was a life lived under relentless violation. 5 plantations meant 5 different environments, 5 different sets of overseers, 5 different households that benefited from her forced labor and forced fertility. Her body became the common denominator, linking estates that otherwise operated independently. She was the connective tissue of a system that refused to see her as anything more than utility. The silence around her movements was deliberate. If she had remained on one plantation, questions might have formed. Familiar faces might have noticed the repetition, the toll it took on her body, the pattern of pregnancies that did not align with marriage or family. By moving her, the system ensured isolation. Each plantation saw only a fragment of her life, never the whole. Each overseer could pretend ignorance. Each owner could deny responsibility. The records made this fragmentation official. They separated events that were deeply connected, disguising continuity as coincidence. Her children, too, were fragmented in ink. Each birth entry stood alone, unconnected to the others. No family tree, no acknowledgement that these children shared a mother, let alone a history. The ledger did not care. It counted infants as future labor or immediate profit, depending on circumstance. Once recorded, the child vanished into the system. Just as the mother moved on to the next plantation, the repetition of her name was the only thread that held the truth together, and even that thread was nearly cut by time. What the records revealed accidentally is what the system worked. tirelessly, to conceal, intentionally. This woman was not simply unlucky. She was selected. Her repeated pregnancies likely marked her as valuable in a way that stripped her of any remaining protection. Fertility became a curse. Each successful birth increased her worth, making her more likely to be transferred, sold, or leased. The ledger entries do not record her resistance, her exhaustion, or her grief, but the frequency of her movement suggests a life lived without rest or stability. Her body was never allowed to heal fully before being claimed again, her identity reduced to a pattern of use. The truth hidden in these records challenges the sanitized narratives that still linger around slavery. It forces us to confront the idea that this was not a chaotic system of individual cruelty alone, but an organized practice with procedures, schedules, and documentation. The fact that her story can be reconstructed at all is a testament to how deeply embedded exploitation was in the bureaucracy of slavery. It was written down, normalized, and archived. The ledgers did not scream, but they remembered. There is a particular cruelty in how her name survived while her voice did not. We do not know what she called herself in private, what she whispered to her children, or how she understood her own suffering. We know her only through the language of those who owned her. Yet even that language betrays them. The repetition exposes intent, it reveals planning. It shows that what happened to her was not incidental, but systematic. The truth did not emerge because someone confessed. It emerged because numbers lined up too perfectly to ignore. In the end, her story is not just about an woman, but about how many others like her disappeared completely. For every name that reappears across ledgers, countless others were renamed, misspelled, or erased so thoroughly that no pattern could ever be traced. Her survival in the records is an accident of bureaucracy, a crack in the system's armor. Through that crack, we glimpse the reality slavery worked so hard to hide that women's bodies were circulated like commodities, their suffering rendered invisible by design. The ledgers meant to reduce her to property, instead preserved her truth, waiting generations for someone to finally read between the lines. What the records described as routine movement was anything but ordinary. In the language of the plantations, her repeated relocation was softened into neutral terms: transfer, assignment, exchange, words that suggested order and necessity rather than coercion. On paper, it looked efficient, even sensible. Labor was moved where it was needed most, assets redistributed according to seasonal demand. But beneath that bureaucratic calm lay a calculated strategy that treated her body as a mobile resource, dispatched with precision from one estate to another. Each move was timed, each destination chosen. The distances between plantations were not accidental. They reflected a network of owners who understood exactly what they were sharing and why. To understand this movement as anything other than forced is to misunderstand the system entirely. Enslaved people did not travel by choice, nor were they consulted about where their lives would unfold. Her relocation was imposed, often abruptly, tearing her from whatever fragile sense of familiarity she had managed to build. One day she was working a field she knew, surrounded by faces she recognized. The next, she was loaded onto a wagon or marched along a dirt road toward a place where no one knew her name beyond what was written on a bill of sale. The record called it transfer. She experienced it as erasure. What makes her story especially revealing is how closely these moves aligned with her pregnancies. Again and again, the paperwork shows her being relocated either shortly before or shortly after giving birth. This was not coincidence. Owners understood fertility as a form of productivity, one that could be optimized across multiple plantations. If one estate lacked enslaved women of childbearing age, another could supply them. Her body became the bridge between these needs, her movement smoothing out shortages the same way livestock or tools might be redistributed. The cruelty of it was disguised by logistics. The system depended on this disguise. By framing forced movement as administrative necessity, plantation owners shielded themselves from moral scrutiny. They could claim detachment, insisting that decisions were driven by economics rather than desire or violence. The ledgers supported this fiction perfectly. They recorded dates and values, not tears or fear. They did not note how she might have clutched her swollen belly during the journey, or how she may have wondered whether the child she carried would be taken from her as soon as it drew breath. The paperwork allowed everyone involved to pretend that nothing personal was happening, yet the consequences of this movement were deeply personal. Each relocation stripped her of continuity, friendships dissolved, any Al's support network she might have relied on vanished overnight. Enslaved communities, fragile as they were, depended on shared experience and mutual care. By moving her repeatedly, the system denied her even that small refuge. Isolation was not a side effect, it was a feature. A woman without roots was easier to control, less likely to resist, less able to be seen as fully human by those who exploited her. Calling this property transfer was not just euphemism, it was ideology. The language reinforced the idea that she was an object, something that could be owned, loaned, or sold without regard for consequence. The same documents that tracked cotton yields and livestock births tracked her movements, collapsing the difference between human life and inventory. This was not accidental sloppiness. It was deliberate dehumanization, embedded in the paperwork so thoroughly that it felt natural to those who used it. Behind these transfers was a quiet cooperation among plantation owners. Estates did not operate in isolation, they were part of a regional economy bound by shared interests and unspoken agreements. When one owner transferred her to another plantation, it was often under conditions that benefited both parties. Her labor and fertility were temporarily reassigned, then moved again when her usefulness shifted. This circulation created a market within the market, one that relied on trust among owners and silence from everyone else. No single plantation bore full responsibility, and that diffusion of responsibility protected the system as a whole. The impact on her children was immediate and devastating. Being moved meant that births occurred in unfamiliar places, often without the presence of anyone who knew her history. Midwives saw her only once, perhaps twice, before she disappeared again. Each child entered the world surrounded by strangers, their mother already marked as temporary. The likelihood of separation increased with every move. A child born on one plantation might never see its mother again if she was transferred shortly afterward. The records did not mark these separations as events worth noting. They were assumed. What the language of transfer hides is the violence of instability. Human beings are not meant to live without continuity, without a sense of place. For her, place was always provisional. Even as her body anchored her to the physical reality of pregnancy, her life was treated as endlessly movable. This contradiction, being forced to carry life while being denied a stable one, was one of the quiet horrors of the system. It ensured that she was always needed, but never allowed to belong. Over time, this pattern of movement would have taken a toll that no ledger could capture. Physical exhaustion layered onto emotional strain. The stress of repeated displacement compounded the dangers of childbirth in an era without medical care. Each journey risked miscarriage, illness, or death. Yet the system calculated these risks coldly. As long as she survived and produced, the transfers continued. Her suffering was an acceptable cost, absorbed into the margins of profit. The phrase disguised as property transfer is not metaphorical. The disguise worked. It allowed generations to look back at these records and see nothing more than transactions. Only when the pattern is examined closely does the truth emerge. This was a company. Ordinated exploitation of a woman's body across multiple sites, carefully managed to avoid scrutiny. The movement was not random, it was purposeful. It was not neutral, it was violent, and it was not rare. Her story forces us to confront how systems of oppression rely on ordinary language to normalize extraordinary harm. Words like transfer and asset, smoothed over realities that would have been unbearable if named honestly. By accepting those words at face value, we risk repeating the erasure they were designed to achieve. The records tell us she moved. Reading between the lines tells us she was moved again and again, because the system found it profitable to do so, and because it trusted that no one would ask why. Each child entered the world already marked for disappearance. The records acknowledged the moment of birth with a neat line of ink, but they refused to recognize what that moment meant, the creation of a family that the system could not allow to exist. On 5 different plantations, her children were born into 5 different realities, each one immediately severed from the others. There was no column for siblings, no space for lineage, no recognition that these births were connected by the same mother's body and blood. The system understood very well that connection was dangerous. Families created bonds, and bonds threatened obedience. So the first act after each birth was not celebration or care, but calculation. How quickly the child could be removed, sold, assigned, or absorbed into labor without leaving a trace that pointed back to her. Separation was not always dramatic. Sometimes it happened quietly, wrapped in procedure. A newborn might be left behind on the plantation where it was born, while the mother was transferred weeks later, her recovery deemed sufficient, her purpose fulfilled. Other times, the child was the one moved, sold off to settle a debt, or traded as part of a larger transaction. The records treated these moments as logistical footnotes, but for her, each separation was a rupture that never healed. She carried 5 children in her body, felt each one grow, endured the pain of bringing them into the world, and then watched them disappear into a system that ensured they would never know one another, and perhaps never know her. The cruelty lay not only in the separation, but in the intentional erasure of connection. By documenting each child independently, the system erased the possibility of a family narrative. Even if, by some chance, 2 of her children ended up on the same plantation years later, nothing in the records would reveal their shared origin. They would pass one another as strangers, their bond dissolved by design. This fragmentation protected ownership. A united family might resist sale. A mother might fight harder for a child she knew she would never see again. By breaking these ties early and completely, the system maintained control. For her, memory became the only place where her children could exist together. She carried their names, their faces, the weight of their absence. But memory was dangerous too. Enslaved women learned to guard their grief carefully, because visible attachment invited punishment. Caring too openly could be interpreted as defiance, as an unwillingness to accept the terms of enslavement. So she learned to mourn quietly, to hold her losses inside where overseers could not see them. The system took her children and demanded that she continue working as if nothing had been taken at all. The records, however, reveal something even more unsettling. This separation was not an unintended consequence of slavery. It was a strategy. Each birth increased her value, but each visible family connection decreased her usefulness. Owners understood that a woman with children at her side was less mobile, more rooted, harder to transfer. By removing the children, they preserved her flexibility as an asset. Her womb was valuable, her motherhood was not. The system exploited one while erasing the other. What becomes clear when examining these ledgers is how deliberately family lines were disrupted. The births were carefully noted, but any detail that might connect one child to another was omitted. No mother's name repeated beside multiple children in the same location. No acknowledgement of siblings born elsewhere. The result was a paper trail that showed productivity without consequence. Children appeared, then vanished. The woman remained, moved again and again, carrying the invisible weight of 5 lives she could not protect. The emotional toll of this pattern is almost impossible to measure, precisely because the system refused to measure it. Trauma did not factor into value assessments. Grief did not reduce quotas. Yet we know that repeated loss reshapes a person. Each separation likely carved something out of her, leaving behind a numbness that was itself a survival strategy. To feel fully would have been unbearable. The system depended on this emotional exhaustion as much as it depended on her physical labor. A woman worn down by loss was less likely to resist, less likely to imagine a future beyond survival. Her children, too, grew up shaped by absence. A child separated at birth might never know why their mother was gone, only that she was gone. Others might remember her face, her voice, only to lose her suddenly without explanation. That confusion became part of their inheritance. The system stole not just relationships, but understanding. It ensured that pain was experienced individually, rather than collectively, preventing shared grief from becoming shared resistance. What makes this story particularly devastating is that it exposes how slavery targeted the most basic human bonds. The right to family, to continuity, to memory, all were stripped away. The woman's repeated pregnancies were recorded as success, but the deliberate destruction of her family was recorded as nothing at all. Silence was the final act of control. By refusing to acknowledge what was lost, the system attempted to make that loss meaningless. And yet, meaning survived in spite of erasure. The very fact that historians can trace these births back to the same woman, across 5 plantations, is evidence that the system did not succeed completely. The truth resurfaced through patterns the records could not fully conceal. Each disconnected entry, when placed alongside the others, reveals the outline of a family that existed, however briefly, in defiance of the system's intent. Her children were separated, but they were real. Their shared origin mattered, even if the ledgers denied it. In the end, this keynote is not just about children taken away. It is about how power fears connection. The system understood that family creates identity, and identity creates resistance. By erasing her children from one another, slavery attempted to erase her humanity as well. But the records, cold and incomplete as they are, betray that effort. They show us a woman who gave birth again and again, and a system that worked tirelessly to ensure that those births would never add up to a family. The overseers who managed the daily operations on the plantations were silent witnesses to a systematic pattern that few dared to name. They recorded work hours, crop yields, and the births of children, but in the margins of their ledgers and in the subtle notations that often went unnoticed, there were hints that they were aware of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this woman's repeated pregnancies. These were not mere clerical observations, they were indications of a knowledge that was both dangerous and compromising. The overseers understood that the same woman appearing across multiple plantations with successive births was no accident, yet the structure in which they operated demanded silence. To acknowledge what they knew would have been to question the morality and legitimacy of a system that depended on their compliance. The overseers' complicity was complex, shaped by power, fear, and self-preservation. On the one hand, they were instruments of the plantation owners, charged with extracting maximum productivity from enslaved individuals. To challenge or expose the deliberate circulation of a woman's body for reproductive purposes would have endangered their positions, potentially costing them employment, reputation, and social standing within a network that valued loyalty above morality. On the other hand, the subtle notes they left in the margins suggest a form of acknowledgement, a tacit admission that they were aware of a calculated exploitation that went far beyond the management of labor. These annotations were not public confessions, but private traces of conscience, or perhaps practical reminders, reflecting their awareness that the woman's repeated pregnancies were anything but routine. The overseer's silence also served to reinforce the power dynamics that defined the plantations. By refusing to speak, they upheld a system in which the bodies of enslaved women were treated as assets rather than human beings. The repeated movement of this woman from one estate to another, timed with pregnancies, was a carefully orchestrated strategy that required complicity at every level. The overseer's role was to ensure that she fulfilled her assigned labor, while also overseeing the conditions of her pregnancies and recovery. They observed, they noted, but they did not intervene, because intervention would have disrupted the economic and social order they were tasked with maintaining. It is impossible to quantify the internal conflict that may have existed among these overseers. Some may have felt unease or even horror at the repeated exploitation, recognizing in private the extraordinary injustice inflicted upon the woman. Others may have rationalized it as a necessary part of the economic system, viewing her repeated pregnancies as an unfortunate but inevitable component of the plantation economy. The margins of the ledgers suggest a quiet acknowledgement, but the broader silence indicates a collective decision to prioritize conformity over conscience. This duality, the awareness of wrongdoing and the decision to remain silent, is central to understanding how such systematic abuse could continue uninterrupted for years. The physical and emotional toll on the woman was magnified by the overseer's role. Their supervision ensured that her movements, her work, and her pregnancies were monitored with precision. Every labor task, every recovery period, and every transfer between plantations was noted, timed, and enforced. They watched as her body was exploited not only for field labor, but also for reproduction, yet they did nothing to protect her. Their inaction was part of the machinery of oppression. By turning a blind eye, they contributed to the erasure of her autonomy and the reinforcement of her objectification. The patterns the overseers observed were not subtle. The timing of her transfers, closely aligned with her pregnancies, and the repeated nature of her relocations made it clear that her reproductive capacity was being leveraged strategically. Each overseer inherited a pattern established by the previous one, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation that spanned multiple estates. The consistency of the documentation indicates that this was an institutionalized practice, and yet the overseer's recognition of it never translated into intervention. Their role became one of silent enforcement, ensuring that the exploitation continued without disruption or exposure. Moreover, the overseer's silence served to shield the plantation owners from scrutiny. Any acknowledgement of the woman's repeated pregnancies could have raised uncomfortable questions about consent, coercion, and the moral legitimacy of the owner's authority. By maintaining a veneer of routine oversight, the overseers allowed the owners to operate without accountability, presenting the circulation of the woman's labor and reproductive power as ordinary administration. In essence, the overseers acted as both witnesses and enforcers, their quiet acknowledgement functioning as a mechanism of complicity that preserved the status quo. The impact of this silent awareness extended beyond the woman herself. Each child born under this system became part of the broader network of exploitation, separated from its siblings and subjected to the same transactional logic. The overseer's recognition of this pattern, coupled with their inaction, contributed to the systematic erasure of family connections and the suppression of maternal bonds. By monitoring but never intervening, they became intermediaries in a chain of abuse that spanned plantations and generations, ensuring that the woman's reproductive labor remained profitable while her personal suffering remained invisible. The psychological dimension of the overseer's silence is also significant. They were intermediaries in a moral system that demanded complicity, forced to reconcile personal knowledge with institutional expectations. In some cases, they may have experienced guilt or discomfort, but the hierarchical and economic pressures of the plantation system likely muted any impulse toward moral action. Fear of reprisal, the normalization of exploitation, and the internalization of systemic values created an environment in which silence became both a survival strategy and a method of enforcement. Their notes in the margins of ledgers are faint echoes of awareness, but they do not constitute intervention or protection. Historians examining these records later are able to detect these subtleties, reading between the lines to reconstruct the presence of conscious observation and deliberate inaction. The overseer's role, therefore, illuminates a broader dynamic in the system of slavery, the way power operates not only through overt violence but also through the maintenance of silence, observation, and calculated inaction. The repeated pregnancies and transfers of a single woman were not possible without the overseer's knowledge. They were not possible without a social and economic environment that normalized observation without accountability. The quiet acknowledgement in the margins, when interpreted carefully, reveals the ethical tension inherent in their position, a tension resolved in favor of maintaining control and perpetuating exploitation. Ultimately, the overseers were both agents and witnesses, caught between the imperatives of profit and the realities of human suffering. Their knowledge of the woman's repeated pregnancies and their conscious choice not to act made them integral participants in the cycle of abuse. The margins of the ledgers, where they subtly recorded dates, ages, or conditions, are the only surviving traces of this awareness. These small notations, while seemingly insignificant at the time, now serve as critical evidence of how systemic exploitation was both observed and perpetuated. They remind us that complicity is not always loud. Often, it is measured in what is watched, known, and left unspoken. The story of the overseers underscores the complexity of accountability within a system designed to erase it. They were neither the originators of the exploitation nor its most powerful beneficiaries. Yet, their position gave them insight that others lacked, and their inaction ensured the continuity of abuse. In this way, the role of the overseers provides a window into the operational mechanics of slavery, a system in which knowledge alone was insufficient to protect victims, where observation without intervention became a form of enforcement, and where the machinery of oppression relied as much on silence as on physical coercion. Their awareness, recorded subtly in the margins, becomes a testament to the quiet complicity that allowed one woman's body to be circulated across 5 plantations, her reproductive labor exploited for profit while her personhood was systematically ignored. The pattern of her repeated pregnancies was not random. It was orchestrated with precision that revealed a deeper, darker purpose. Plantation owners and managers had long recognized that the reproductive capacity of enslaved women was itself a commodity, one that could be manipulated to maximize profit across multiple estates. Each pregnancy added to the economic value of the woman, yet this value was measured entirely in terms of labor and offspring, never in terms of her humanity. By examining the timing and coordination of her transfers, it becomes clear that she was moved strategically to ensure that her fertility served as efficiently as possible. Each relocation was planned to align with the expected outcomes of pregnancy, ensuring the continuation of a cycle that benefited the owners while erasing her agency. This orchestration relied on careful observation and record-keeping. Plantation ledgers tracked births meticulously, noting the sex of the child, the date of delivery, and, in some cases, the condition of the mother. To modern eyes, these entries may seem clinical, but within them lies evidence of a system that monitored her reproductive life with the same attention as it did fields of cotton or barrels of sugar. The pattern is unmistakable. As soon as she recovered from one pregnant, she was moved to another plantation, often one where her next pregnancy could yield maximum economic benefit. The timing was not coincidental. It was evidence of a calculated exploitation that was institutionalized across estates. The consequences of such careful coordination were profound and deeply personal. Pregnancy is not a passive state, and the physical toll on her body would have been immense. The repeated pregnancies, combined with the demands of field labor and domestic work, left her body in a constant state of strain. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and lack of medical care would have compounded the risks inherent in childbirth during that era. Yet these risks were calculated, weighed against the potential profit from her reproductive output. Her health and well-being were secondary considerations subordinated to the economic objectives of the plantations. The system measured only the productivity of her body, never the suffering it endured. The coordination of her pregnancies also reflects a broader pattern of exploitation that extended beyond a single plantation. Multiple owners participated in this system, effectively sharing her as a reproductive resource. By moving her strategically, each estate could benefit from her fertility without assuming full responsibility for her care or the long-term consequences of her pregnancies. She became a mobile instrument of profit. Her body circulated between properties in a manner that resembled livestock or tools more than human life. This deliberate orchestration underscores the systematic nature of reproductive exploitation within the institution of slavery. Psychologically, the effects of such manipulation were devastating. She would have been acutely aware of her lack of control over her own body and the lives she was forced to create. Each pregnancy represented not only physical labor but emotional labor as well, grief, fear, and despair compounded with every birth. The knowledge that her children would likely be separated from her, or that they were being used as instruments of economic gain, would have created a persistent sense of helplessness. This emotional burden, invisible in the ledgers and invisible to the overseers, was yet another aspect of the system's violence. The pattern also reveals the complicity of broader networks of power. Overseers, clerks, and even neighboring plantation owners would have recognized the regularity of her pregnancies and transfers. Yet the system relied on a collective denial, a tacit agreement to view her reproductive life as a series of administrative events, rather than as evidence of repeated abuse. The coordination required more than individual cruelty. It required an entire economic and social structure designed to normalize and perpetuate such exploitation. Her experience was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how the system operated at scale. The deliberate timing of her movements in relation to her pregnancies also had consequences for her children. Many of them were born into circumstances where maternal care was immediately compromised. Separation from their mother was almost inevitable, either through sale or transfer to other plantations, reinforcing a cycle of family disruption that was central to the system of slavery. The children were treated as extensions of property rather than as human beings, and their upbringing as dictated entirely by economic considerations. This separation further dehumanized the mother, whose reproductive labor was divorced from the nurturing aspect of motherhood by design. The strategic orchestration of her pregnancies also underscores the way in which slavery commodified life itself. Her body, her fertility, and even the children she bore were subject to calculation, valued for their potential to generate future labor and profit. This system reduced human beings to measurable outputs, creating an economy in which reproduction itself was a currency. The coordination of her movements demonstrates the cold efficiency with which enslaved women were used to sustain the economic foundations of the South. Each pregnancy was planned, each transfer executed, each child assessed for value, revealing a level of premeditation that transforms what might appear as routine exploitation into deliberate, systematic abuse. This orchestration also highlights the invisibility of her experience within historical records. While the economic outputs were meticulously documented, the human cost, the physical exhaustion, emotional suffering, and psychological trauma was invisible. The very same ledgers that track her reproductive output fail to acknowledge the violence inflicted upon her. Her life and labor were codified in numbers and dates, but her voice, her pain, and her agency were absent. It is through careful historical reconstruction, reading between the lines of these administrative documents, that we begin to understand the full scope of her exploitation. The repeated pregnancies orchestrated across multiple plantations also reveal the intersection of sexual exploitation and economic calculation. Enslaved women's fertility was not merely a byproduct of their oppression. It was actively managed, commodified, and leveraged. Owners, clerks, and overseers all played roles in ensuring that the timing and placement of her pregnancies maximized profit. This manipulation extended beyond physical labor into the realm of reproductive coercion, exposing the ways in which the institution of slavery controlled the most intimate aspects of human life for economic gain. Ultimately, the orchestration of her pregnancies illuminates a broader truth about the institution of slavery. It was a system designed to extract value from human bodies in every conceivable form. Her repeated transfers, timed with precision to align with reproductive cycles, demonstrate the extent to which enslaved women were exploited, not only for their labor, but for their ability to produce life itself. The careful calculation behind each pregnancy, each transfer, and each record entry provides a chilling insight into the machinery of oppression. The woman's experience stands as a testament to the deliberate, systemic nature of reproductive exploitation and the enduring human cost of a system that valued profit above all else. The reason she was never allowed to remain on a single plantation for long was rooted in a calculated cruelty that extended far beyond simple labor demands. The moment an enslaved woman became known for repeated pregnancies, her presence became a liability to the very system that sought to profit from her body. Plantation owners, overseers, and managers understood that familiarity could breed questions, attachments, and even resistance. A woman who stayed in on a place too long might develop bonds with others, witness the abuses inflicted on children or co-workers, or gain a measure of autonomy that could disrupt the delicate balance of control. By moving her constantly, the system ensured that she remained isolated, disoriented, and fully under the authority of those who profited from her labor and reproductive capacity. The transfers were not merely administrative. They were a mechanism of psychological domination designed to prevent her from developing roots, both physically and emotionally, that might challenge her exploitation. Each relocation uprooted her from any semblance of community. On plantations, enslaved people relied on informal networks of care, mutual support, and communication to survive. Friends and family, even if fragmented, offered protection, advice, and emotional sustenance. By moving her repeatedly, the system denied her the ability to form these crucial bonds. She became a stranger in every place she arrived, forced to navigate new expectations, harsh overseers, and unfamiliar labor routines, while carrying the weight of repeated pregnancies. This isolation amplified the violence of her exploitation. Without support, she had no advocate to plead for her safety, to intervene on her behalf during childbirth, or to protect her children from immediate separation. The constant movement ensured that she remained vulnerable and that her body and reproductive labor could be controlled with absolute efficiency. The timing of her relocations also played a critical role in maintaining control. Each transfer occurred when she was most vulnerable, either recovering from childbirth, pregnant again, or weakened by labor. By removing her from one plantation at these crucial moments, the system prevented any single overseer or owner from witnessing the full scope of her suffering. No one estate had to bear the moral or logistical consequences of her repeated pregnancies. This deliberate fragmentation created a structure in which exploitation could continue uninterrupted. Her body, her health, and her children were divided across estates, never belonging fully to anyone, and certainly not to her. She existed only as a resource to be moved where it was needed most, and no longer. This forced mobility also served to obscure the pattern of abuse. By transferring her frequently, the owners ensured that anyone who might notice the repetitive nature of her pregnancies, whether clerks, fellow enslaved individuals, or even sympathetic overseers, would only see fragments of the story. In isolation, each instance of pregnancy might have appeared unfortunate but ordinary, a single woman enduring the hardships of life under slavery. But seen as a whole, the repeated pregnancies across multiple plantations revealed an orchestrated exploitation. The deliberate relocation prevented any observer from connecting the dots, allowing the system to operate with a level of impunity that would have been impossible if she had remained in one place. The psychological impact of being perpetually moved was profound. A person's sense of identity is tied to place, relationships, and continuity. By stripping her of these anchors, the system enforced a constant state of disorientation and subjugation. Each new plantation represented uncertainty, unfamiliar labor expectations, new overseers, different rules, and often Harsher punishments. The unpredictability heightened her vulnerability and reduced the likelihood of resistance. Her mind and body were kept in a continuous state of adaptation, leaving little space for reflection, memory, or the cultivation of resilience. The system understood that a constantly uprooted person is easier to control, easier to exploit, and less likely to claim autonomy over her own life and body. Her children were also profoundly affected by her constant relocation. Separation from siblings, partial family networks, and the mother herself became inevitable consequences of her movement. Each transfer increased the likelihood that a child would be sold, moved, or absorbed into a different plantation system before bonds could form. The children were treated as commodities in the same ledger as livestock, evaluated for their labor potential rather than their emotional needs. For the mother, the repeated separations compounded grief and trauma. Each relocation was not only a disruption to her own life, but a deliberate attack on her capacity to nurture, to bond, and to claim agency over her children's lives. The system's logic extended even to mitigating questions or challenges from others. If she remained in one location, her continuous pregnancies would become visible to any owner, overseer, or worker paying attention. Questions might arise about consent, morality, or the extent of exploitation. By moving her between estates, the system fragmented knowledge, leaving no single estate fully accountable. The transfers functioned as a form of damage control, designed to keep the truth of her exploitation compartmentalized and hidden. It was a strategy that relied on secrecy, dispersion, and the assumption that no one would trace the pattern across multiple locations. Beyond the immediate impact on her and her children, this constant movement highlights the systemic nature of slavery's exploitation. It reveals a calculated orchestration in which the reproductive labor of women was not merely incidental but actively managed. Each relocation was planned to maximize productivity and minimize disruption to the owner's economic interests. The human consequences, physical exhaustion, emotional trauma, and familial fragmentation, were treated as externalities, irrelevant to the calculations of profit. Her life became an instrument of economic strategy, a tool to be moved and measured, her agency systematically removed to ensure the continuity of the system. Her story also illustrates the way power operated in subtle and invisible ways. Control was not exercised only through overt violence or punishment. It was exercised through mobility, through the regulation of space and continuity. By dictating where she lived and when she moved, the system exerted influence over her body, mind, and relationships. Every transfer reinforced the hierarchy of authority, demonstrating that even something as personal as place of residence was subject to the owner's will. The physical act of moving her across plantations was a powerful method of social and psychological domination, one that left no traces in public record except the cold language of transfer or assignment. Over time, the cumulative effect of these transfers would have been devastating. Each new plantation brought fresh challenges, new labor demands, and renewed emotional stress. Her sense of self would have been continually tested, reshaped by the necessity to adapt to ever-changing circumstances. The lack of stability prevented her from forming long-term relationships, building community, or establishing any semblance of safety. The system ensured that she remained in a constant state of survival, focused on the immediate demands of labor and childbirth, rather than on her own well-being or that of her children. The transfers also reveal the economic rationale behind emotional and physical violence. By controlling her location, the owners ensured that her reproductive labor remained profitable while minimizing complications. Her body was a movable asset, transported to wherever it could yield maximum benefit. Each relocation was an investment strategy, calculated to sustain and expand the productivity of multiple plantations without exposing the owners to moral or legal scrutiny. The system exploited every aspect of her life, physical, emotional, and reproductive. With meticulous attention, turning mobility into a method of oppression, ultimately the reason she was never allowed to stay in one place, underscores a fundamental truth about slavery. It was not merely a system of labor exploitation, but a system of total control. By denying her stability, the plantation owners denied her the most basic human rights, the right to a home, to community, to continuity, and to family. Each transfer reinforced her vulnerability, ensured her exploitation, and perpetuated the system's capacity to extract profit from human life. The deliberate movement of her body across multiple estates is a testament to the cruelty, planning, and systemic nature of slavery. revealing a machinery of oppression that treated mobility as both a strategy of control and a tool of calculated exploitation. The survival of the ledger in which her life was recorded is a haunting paradox. While she herself disappeared into the machinery of slavery, her name known only to those who owned her, her voice silenced by fear and coercion, the financial documents endured. These ledgers, meticulously maintained, cataloged her presence across multiple plantations, each page listing the dates of her births, the movements between estates, and the economic value assigned to her labor and her children. It is ironic that the thing that survived to tell her story was not her own testimony, her memories, or the accounts of those who lived alongside her, but a cold, impersonal record designed to reduce her existence to numbers and transactions. Yet it is precisely in these numbers that the truth of her exploitation endures, speaking across centuries to reveal a life lived under relentless control and manipulation. The ledger itself is a remarkable artifact of the system, both in its precision and its indifference. Every entry was created with care, ensuring that the value of her labor and her reproductive output was accurately recorded. There was attention to dates, to the sex of each child, to the timing of transfers, and to any changes in valuation that reflected age, health, or productivity. The people who maintained these records did not intend to preserve a human story. They intended to maintain accountability, profitability, and administrative order. Yet, in its meticulous tracking, the ledger inadvertently captures a pattern that no human agent could have fully controlled. The repetition of her name, the regularity of her transfers, and the documentation of successive births across 5 plantations form a traceable map of systemic abuse. In attempting to reduce her to property, the ledger became the only surviving evidence of her lived reality. Historians who examine such documents often speak of reading between the lines, and nowhere is this more necessary than here. The ledger offers no descriptions of suffering, no acknowledgement of emotional trauma, no record of resistance. It does not note her fear when taken from one plantation to another, the exhaustion of repeated pregnancies, or the grief of separation from her children. Yet these experiences can be inferred through the careful arrangement of data. Each transfer, timed in proximity to childbirth, reveals a calculated exploitation that the ledger itself was never intended to make visible. The cold precision of accounting inadvertently immortalizes what human memory could not always preserve. The story of a woman whose life was dictated by others, yet whose endurance was extraordinary. The ledger also highlights the erasure of the woman herself as a person. In the spaces between the numbers, we sense what the record cannot contain: her voice, her emotions, and her agency. Each child listed is a life reduced to a line in a column, stripped of context and relationship. Yet paradoxically, these same entries, when viewed in totality, reveal the extent of her reproductive labor and the scope of her exploitation. Her identity, while obscured by the language of property, is made legible through patterns. The ledger becomes a testament to the way systemic cruelty can leave traces even when human stories are actively suppressed. The endurance of the ledger also speaks to the permanence of bureaucratic memory in contrast to human memory. Names, dates, and valuations survive centuries, whereas the experiences and personal histories of the people recorded were often lost. In this way, the ledger functions as a distorted monument, a structure that preserves aspects of a person's life while ignoring their humanity. Yet even in its distortion, it holds an irrefutable truth. The repetition of her name, the timing of her movements, and the systematic recording of her children across multiple plantations cannot be dismissed as coincidence or clerical error. The ledger reveals a pattern that points unflinchingly to deliberate, organized exploitation. Her survival in the records also underscores the contrast between the permanence of documentation and the impermanence of human lives under slavery. Her body, her labor, and her children were vulnerable to immediate danger, sale, or forced transfer, but the ledger endured. It preserved evidence that might otherwise have been lost to time. This creates a tension between erasure and remembrance. While her lived experience was largely invisible to contemporaries and contemporaneous observers, the administrative machinery of oppression inadvertently left behind the raw material for later generations to reconstruct her story. In that sense, the ledger serves as both witness and archive, a testament to human endurance inscribed in the language of exploitation. The ledger's survival also allows for a broader understanding of the economic calculations behind slavery. Each entry, each birth, transfer, and valuation demonstrates how the system measured human life in terms of profitability. The repetition of her name highlights the ways in which her reproductive labor was exploited across multiple estates, coordinated to maximize output while minimizing attention. By following her trajectory through the records, one can see how slavery operated not only through brute force, but through meticulous planning and record-keeping. The ledger preserves this logic, providing concrete evidence of the deliberate strategies used to commodify human life. Yet within this stark documentation, there is an implicit testimony to resilience. Despite the dehumanizing context, the very fact that she bore children, endured repeated relocations, and continued to exist across multiple plantations, speaks to a profound persistence. The ledger, though impersonal, inadvertently records acts of survival. Each entry represents not only exploitation, but also the endurance of a person whose body and will were subjected to relentless control. The records may have sought to reduce her to numbers, but the repeated pattern of her existence across plantations reveals a quiet defiance of erasure. She remained present, tangible, and traceable, even in the absence of her own voice. The ledger's survival also provides a lens for understanding how systemic oppression leaves legacies that extend far beyond the immediate moment. Through its preservation, historians and descendants can reconstruct the contours of her life, revealing patterns that the system attempted to conceal. The record becomes a bridge across time, connecting the realities of slavery to the present and allowing contemporary audiences to confront the calculated violence that shaped her existence. In this way, the ledger functions not only as a historical artifact, but as a moral document, one that demands acknowledgement of both the cruelty inflicted and the resilience demonstrated. Moreover, the ledger reveals the tension between visibility and invisibility in the system of slavery. Her life was highly visible to those who profited from her labor and reproduction, yet invisible in terms of humanity, dignity, and personal experience. The ledger enshrines this duality. It preserves the factual outlines of her exploitation while omitting any sense of her interior life. In doing so, it forces modern readers to consider the human cost that lies behind administrative records. Each line becomes a silent testimony to suffering, loss, and endurance, a story waiting to be read, interpreted, and remembered. Ultimately, the ledger that survived when she did not stands as a paradoxical witness. Intended as a tool of control and documentation, it became a vessel of historical memory, preserving a life that the system sought to erase. In its precise and impersonal columns, it captures the repetition, calculation, and deliberate exploitation of a woman whose existence was divided across plantations, whose children were separated, and whose agency was continually denied. Yet in preserving this evidence, it also preserves the contours of her story, the trace of her humanity, and the undeniable fact that a single life, recorded in cold numbers, can speak across centuries. The ledger endures as a testament to the intersection of brutality and resilience, a reminder that even in the most dehumanizing systems, evidence of suffering, survival, and the human spirit can persist. The final truth of her life, the one that even the ledgers could not fully contain, was the resilience she carried in spite of everything. Across 5 plantations, through repeated pregnancies, forced relocations, and the constant threat of separation from her children, she endured. Her body, documented relentlessly as property, was in fact the site of extraordinary endurance, a vessel of survival and quiet defiance. Each time she gave birth, each time she moved, and each time she recovered from the physical and emotional strain, she demonstrated a persistence that the system could neither measure nor suppress. While plantation owners and overseers sought to reduce her to labor and fertility, her existence defied simple categorization. She remained human, thinking, feeling, grieving, and surviving, even in the face of deliberate erasure. Her story also reveals the depth of the psychological strategies embedded within slavery. The repeated transfers, the fragmentation of her family, and the control over her reproductive capacity were all designed to instill dependence and submission. Yet, within these conditions, she navigated survival in ways that the system could not control. Her endurance was a form of resistance. Each pregnancy carried to term, each child born, and each day survived was an act of defiance against a structure that sought total domination. Her body became both a tool of exploitation and a testament to human resilience, proving that the capacity to endure is not always visible to those who attempt to quantify or control it. The resilience she displayed was not only physical, but also emotional and mental. The repeated trauma of displacement, the grief of losing children to sale or relocation, and the continual demands of labor and pregnancy would have crushed many. Yet she developed strategies to cope, to survive, and perhaps even to preserve hope. These strategies were often invisible: quiet endurance, careful observation, subtle negotiation of labor demands, or forging transient connections with others who could offer moments of support. Her intelligence and awareness allowed her to navigate a system designed to strip her of agency, making her survival both a testament to human ingenuity and a form of resistance against oppression. Her children, born across different plantations, also reflect the consequences of her resilience. While the system sought to treat them as separate commodities, disconnected and untraceable, they were bound together by their shared origin and by the unrecorded memories she carried with her. Her knowledge of each child, her memory of their births, their characteristics, and her care, even if fleeting, established invisible ties that the plantation system could not fully erase. In this way, her maternal presence persisted even across forced separations, creating a quiet continuity that defied the system's intent to fragment and commodify her family. The legacy of her life extends beyond the immediate experience of exploitation. Her story, reconstructed from fragmentary records and historical research, illuminates the systemic mechanisms of slavery and the calculated cruelty imposed on enslaved women. It demonstrates how reproductive labor was controlled, exploited, and mobilized across multiple estates for economic gain. It reveals the intersection of physical labor, reproductive coercion, and psychological manipulation that defined the lives of many women in similar circumstances. Yet within this broader structural analysis, her personal resilience shines as a reminder of the enduring human spirit under extreme duress. Her endurance also highlights the way in which historical memory is constructed. For centuries, her life, like those of many enslaved women, was obscured by the impersonal language of records, the biases of chroniclers, and the erasure of personal experience in favor of economic documentation. Modern historians, by reading between the lines, are able to reconstruct not just the events of her life, but the lived reality behind them. In doing so, her story becomes more than a historical artifact. It becomes a lens through which we can understand the emotional, physical, and social dimensions of slavery. Her resilience, once hidden in the margins of ledgers, now emerges as a central element of historical understanding. Her ability to endure also reflects the broader context of enslaved women's experiences. Across the South, countless women navigated similar conditions: repeated pregnancies, forced labor, and systemic attempts to erase family bonds. Each story was unique, yet patterns emerge that reveal the calculated exploitation of reproductive labor and the strategic manipulation of human relationships for economic gain. Her experience, while extreme in its repetition and documentation, is emblematic of the broader mechanisms of control used to sustain slavery. Her resilience, therefore, is both personal and representative, illuminating the lived reality of a system designed to crush human autonomy. The final aspect of her resilience lies in its capacity to speak across time. While her life was subjected to erasure in the immediate moment, the records she left behind, the traces historians have